And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about our young people and going on to the next phase of their life, and particularly with preparing yourself for whatever your vocation is going to be, whatever your work is going to be, according to our plans, which we know are never certain, but for your adulthood and for the future of your professional or your working life, whatever the case may be. And I was thinking about how we think about it when we're young, when we're really small children, and how it sort of changes as we get older. And when you're young, you see yourself as conquering the world. You see yourself as doing great things that nobody else can do. And I got to thinking about heroes and superheroes. And our country in the last couple of weeks has been taken, the whole world in a sense, or a big part of the world has been taken, captive almost by a superheroes movie, which has just apparently a gigantic number of these superheroes. And I confess, and you can tell by the way I talk about it, that it's not my cup of tea. I don't watch most of those movies and don't find them very entertaining. But I understand that most of the world does, and I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying it's not my cup of tea. 25 years ago, maybe it would have been. But I thought about the kinds of things that we look at, because I do like other movies that feature heroes where people, take on great odds and do great things at great risk to themselves, things of that nature. But what does Jesus see as heroic? What kind of people does Jesus hold up as somebody to be honored, somebody to be copied or emulated, somebody who he would point to and say, I want my followers to be like that? Well, we have an example of that here in Luke chapter 10, where we have what we know of as the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I suspect that almost everybody here was pretty well familiar with the details of this parable before Brad even read it this morning. And I want us to talk about the details a little bit today, but I also want to notice sort of the relationships that are swirling while this parable is given, and then see what Jesus does with this parable, or what Jesus is doing with this parable as he does it. If you look here in Luke chapter 10 and you back up to verse 25, you see the situation in which Jesus tells this story, when he tells the story of the man who was robbed and left for dead. Verse 25 says, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Now I just want to point out for just a second here that the word lawyer means expert in Jewish law. It doesn't really mean, in the context of the New Testament, a person who went to court and spoke on behalf of another person. It means a person who was recognized as an authority figure to explain to people what the law of God was. So this is a religious person who is considered an expert in what the Word of God says. All right? This person comes and he asks Jesus this question, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Verse 26, he said to him, what is written in the law? How does it read to you? So Jesus says, acknowledging sort of implicitly, well, you're an expert in the law. Why don't you tell us? Jesus responds to the question with a question. And he's not hesitant to be frustrating to his inquisitors. Jesus isn't oftentimes. But the man answers in verse 27, he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Now that looks familiar to you because probably you know what Luke 10 Luke 10 says, but also because it sounds like something that Jesus said somewhere else. But it's very interesting that in the other passage, which we'll look at in a moment, it comes out of Jesus' mouth, and here it comes out of an expert in the law's mouth. And if you look back at verse 25, it says that this expert has come to put Jesus to the test. The expert is not here because he wants to be a follower of Jesus. He hasn't decided, maybe I should become one of his disciples. He hasn't already become a disciple. He's come to try to expose Jesus. He's come to put him to the test. But then when he responds with, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And then he puts the second thing in there. Now, if you go over to Matthew chapter 22, that's where Jesus said the same thing. Matthew chapter 22, in verse 36, verse 35, says, one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. Verse 36, he asked Jesus, Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God. Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This was not a new concept to Jewish people. When Jewish children were raised, and when they were given instruction and classes, sort of their go-to format for teaching their children, they taught their children the greatest commandment in the law is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is not new information. And so when Jesus says this in Matthew 22, he doesn't surprise anybody. And when the lawyer in Luke chapter 10 says the same thing, he doesn't surprise anybody. But in Matthew 22, Jesus says this is the great and foremost commandment. But then in verse 39, he says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now this is new. This is different. Nobody said this. Nobody taught their children the second greatest commandment in the law is to love your neighbor as yourself. This is revolutionary. If you look at where you shall love your neighbor as yourself comes from in the book of Leviticus, and it only appears once, it's just this small little thing in this long list of specific regulations. It doesn't look like a big deal when you read the Old Testament. But Jesus raises it up and he says, this is second only to you shall love the Lord your God with everything you've got. So you come back to Luke chapter 10. And this man says the same thing. The teacher or the lawyer, the expert in the law, giving it back to Jesus, he adds, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I shouldn't have said to go back to Luke chapter 10. You don't have to go back to Matthew. But if you go back to Matthew, you see that what's happening in Luke chapter 10 with this lawyer coming to him to test him is the same thing that's happening in Matthew chapter 22. If you back up in Matthew chapter 22 to verse 15, it says, the Pharisees went and plotted together how to trap Jesus and what he might say. And then they go to him, they ask him, is it lawful to pay the poll tax to Caesar? Then in verse 23, Sadducees came to Jesus and questioned him, and they asked him about the woman who was married to 7 successive brothers, all of whom died. And then in verse 34, when the Pharisees hear that Jesus put the Sadducees down, so he's put the Pharisees down, he's answered their question, he's put the Sadducees down. Now the Pharisees come back the third time, and they say, what's the greatest commandment? So this question, what is the greatest commandment to Jesus, is part of a series of traps that the Pharisees and Sadducees have been trying to set for Jesus. And then you come to Luke chapter 10, and it's the same trap. The lawyer comes to put him to the test. So what probably is happening here is Luke chapter 10 occurs after the events recorded in Matthew chapter 22. Probably what we're looking at here is these events, these conversations, these confrontations of Matthew chapter 22 have occurred, and now the Pharisees have gone back and they've said, man, he's got an answer for everything. We can't find anything. And so either as a group they decide, or one of their number, because the scribes and Pharisees are in tandem, and a scribe is tantamount to an expert in the law, or maybe a stepping stone to becoming a teacher or a lawyer, an expert in the law. One of them says, well, I got a question he can't answer. And that's probably Luke chapter 10. In Luke chapter 10, he gives Jesus back his own words. He gives him, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus responds favorably. He says, that's right. You got it exactly right. But then the lawyer says, hey, I got another question for you. Who's my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? Now, the Jewish people have a very specific attitude toward the answer to that question. The Jewish people think, well, my neighbor are brother and sister Jews who are like me. And sometimes we Americans have a very specific answer to that question. And we say, well, it's the person who lives beside me, or at least pretty close to me. And it might sometimes apply to the people who work beside me too. But usually it's just people who live beside me. And in response to this question, Jesus changes the world. And his response changed the world when he said it, and it continues to change the world today. Amen. And his response is, let me tell you about a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho. This man is attacked by robbers, and they beat him, and they strip off all his clothes. Why do they strip off all his clothes? It's not to humiliate him. It's because clothing was so valuable. Because clothing took a lot of labor to create. And so it cost a lot of money. And so most people had very few clothing or sets of clothing. And so clothing was very valuable. And so anytime somebody got mugged, they didn't just take your money, they took your clothes. And they left you naked. And that's what happened to this man. And then Jesus gives us the hero to the story that Jesus tells to deal with this expert trapper's question. Who is my neighbor? He says, well, this man is left bleeding, naked on the side of the road, and a priest comes along, and the priest sees him. The priests are in charge not only of serving at the temple, of serving and handling the sacrifices and presenting the sacrifices to God and being the go-between so that people can worship God. They're also in charge of teaching the people. And so that's why they don't live in Jerusalem all the time, but they're spread throughout Israel so that they can be sources of knowledge of the law of God for people. The priest goes over to the other side and gets as far away from this bleeding naked man as he can. A little while, a Levite comes along. A Levite, one step down from a priest. They are the priestly tribe, but they're not priests. They are servants. They handle the animals, they carry out the trash, they carry off the ashes, they bring in the wood, they cut. They do the things that allow the worship to go on, that allow the sacrifices to be made. They're in charge of the logistics of the temple. The Levite gets over to the other side of the road. He sees the man, but he goes by him and leaves him lying there bleeding. What's Jesus saying here? It's not the religious people who are my heroes. It's not the religious people that I would hold people up to emulate. And who does he select instead? Verse 33. a Samaritan who was on a journey. What's Jesus teaching when He points out the lack of compassion and the lack of help from the two religious people of the Jewish nation, and then focuses instead on the actions of a Samaritan? At the very least, at the absolute least, He's focusing on the importance of every individual. He's focusing on the importance of every single soul. And just as a big picture principle to our young people, to our graduates, and to everybody, I would say life on this earth is about other people. And when you think about choosing a vocation or choosing a future employment or whatever the case may be, let me tell you something about every job, every business, every employment in the world. Every one of them gets its meaning, gets its importance from the effect that it has on other people. And so if you're a computer programmer, it may seem like it has nothing to do with other people. I knew a guy who went to medical school and he wanted to be the kind of doctor who reads x-rays because he didn't want to have to see patients. He didn't want any patient interaction. But the reason they have doctors read x-rays is because of the effect on the patients. The reason that job is important is because it impacts people's lives. And it's the same for a computer programmer. It's the same for a car mechanic. It's the same for a bridge builder. Every job, every employment in the world gets its meaning or lack thereof from its effect on other people. And if you want a job that's important, then you think to yourself, what effect does this have on other people? Galatians chapter 5, verse 14. Holy Spirit inspires Paul to say, for the whole law is fulfilled in this one statement. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Other people are important to God. Therefore, other people must be important to God's people. And people who live a life that says, God is important to me, my life is all about God, that's a good thing. But if they're also saying, other people are not important to me, then the first is not true. The first is not true. Because if God were important to you, then other people would be important to you. And that's what the Levite and the priest missed. That's what they didn't understand. But look who did understand it. The Samaritan. Jesus says there in verse 33, a Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. Why did the Samaritan stop? Why did the Samaritan do what he did? Because he felt compassion. You see, Jesus wants your emotions too. Jesus wants your feelings. He wants to develop what's inside of you, how you look at the world, how you look at other people, and He wants to treat that with mercy. He wants to treat that with kindness so that the seeds of mercy and kindness and compassion grow up and bear fruit in your own life. Because He felt compassion. Now, why is this revolutionary? How does this change the world? Well, it's illogical that the Samaritan would feel compassion on this injured Jew. Because it's hard to overstate the dislike between Jews and Samaritans. Samaritans live close to the Jews, and they're also partially descended from the Jews. They share a common ancestry in part with the Jews, but the rest of the Samaritans' ancestry comes from people who were imported into Israel after they were taken captive by the Assyrians. And so when the Assyrians captured Israel, the northern tribes, they brought these people in, and God sent all kind of punishment to them. And so they said, well, we need to bring some of the Jews back. And so they brought some of the Jews back to teach the people living in the land how to not be killed by God, how to stop offending God's wrath so that He would stop sending pestilence on them. And then they intermarried, and they kept their own pagan culture and their own pagan religion, and they mixed it with biblical religion and godly religion. And this group called the Samaritans developed because they lived in Samaria. That was their capital at the time. And so now the Jews who have come out of exile themselves but haven't intermarried with other people, they hate the Samaritans. A Jew won't talk to a Samaritan. He won't eat with a Samaritan. He won't go into a Samaritan. He won't even touch a Samaritan. And so you can imagine how the Samaritans feel about the Jews. It's exactly the same way. They respond just like humans respond when they're disrespected and mistreated. They hate the Jews. But this Samaritan sees a Jew lying beside the road, bleeding, wounded, naked. And he stops. And not only does he touch him, he bandages his wounds. And not only that, he puts this man on his own animal, and he takes the servant role and he walks while the Jew rides. And not only that, he takes him to an inn and he spends the night in the same room with this Jew. Do you see what a revolutionary thing to do that would have been? And not only that, he pays money on behalf of this man, and then he leaves money to provide for this man when he's gone, and then he comes back. So that's Jesus' story. But then the real kicker, the real punch of the story is at the end. And so you see what Jesus does at the end. Verse 36, he looks at this lawyer and he says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? Now, it's one thing to have somebody tell you something and to convince you that it's true. But it's another thing when you have to admit it with your own lips. When it comes out of your own mouth. When it comes out of your own mouth, you're making a commitment. You're not only nodding your head, but you're saying, I believe it. You're saying it's been proven and it's true and I understand it, and therefore I am beholden to believe it and to follow it. And that's what Jesus does to this expert in the law. He says, you tell me which one was a neighbor. And the man says, in verse 37, the one who showed mercy toward him. Now there are a lot of people in the world today who have never read the New Testament. There are a lot of people in the world today who believe that Jesus is nobody who should be followed, who believe that God does not exist, and who believe that Christianity should be snuffed out. But most of them, almost all of them, believe that you should love your neighbor. And almost all of them understand that your neighbor is whoever it is that you can help. And it's not the Samaritan who is the real hero of the story. It is the teller of the story who, with this simple illustration, changed the world. He changed how the entire world sees other people and how they know they should treat other people. And so you go into places that have no influence of Christianity. You go into countries and parts of the world where their last centuries are bereft of the New Testament. And you don't see much influence of this. You don't see people complaining about the poor. You don't see people complaining about charity. You don't see people complaining about how others are left behind and not taken care of. But you come to the Western world where the Bible has been readily available and has been held up and taught, maybe not universally believed, but has been explained and held up. And people disagree about how to do it. People disagree about the role government should play in doing it. But pretty much everybody believes that we should help those who need help. And I'll tell you, the only reason that's true is because of what Jesus taught. And even though those people reject Jesus and they say He shouldn't be followed, even though they don't know it, they're following Him to this extent. Because He is the Lord of heaven and earth. And the Lord of heaven and earth, with a very simple story, can change how people think and what people believe is important. And so what we believe is important should reflect what He believes is important. And what He believes is important is helping people when we have the opportunity. You don't need a superpower. You don't need billions of dollars. You don't need to be different than the rest of the world. In fact, you can be ostracized and pushed to the side and mistreated by the rest of the world and still be a hero. All you've got to do is take the opportunities that are put in front of you to help other people. And that's what Jesus said. And that's what Jesus teaches. But the fact that He can do it, the fact that He can change the world with such a simple story, tells you your relationship to Him. It tells you that He is Lord, that He is God, that He is the master of the universe. And that means that you owe Him. You owe Him your life. You owe Him your blessings. You owe Him your existence. You owe Him worship. You owe Him obedience. You owe Him faith. If you haven't been giving Him the position in your life that He's earned, to which He is entitled by His very nature, He's been compassionate with you. He's been patient with you. Even if you've mistreated Him, He's treated you well. It's time for you to respond. Imagine the ugliness if this Jewish man had recovered from his wounds, and then he looked at that Samaritan and says, "How dare you touch me? I don't want anything to do with you." That's how most of the world is treating Jesus. That's how most of the world is treating Jesus. Don't follow suit. Treat Him like He is who He really is, which is the Lord of heaven and earth. If you need to come to Christ for the first time, to put Him on in baptism, if you need to return to Christ, whatever your need, please come down front as we stand and sing.